His body was stabbed over 30 times by his own guards, then dumped into a shallow grave, half buried and already rotting by morning. The Emperor of Rome was dead. His blood pooled on the marble floor of a palace corridor, still echoing with the footsteps of assassins. Not a single citizen wept. His guards didn't hesitate. His advisors didn't resist. His death was not seen as a tragedy. It was a relief. Only 4 years earlier, Caligula was welcomed as a savior. He was young, charming, and promised to restore Rome's glory. But something changed. Or maybe something inside him had always been broken. Soon, senators were executed for making eye contact. Families were killed for jokes whispered at dinner. And then, as if to humiliate the entire empire, he gave his horse a marble stall, a golden trough, and declared it a Roman priest. This wasn't a political collapse. It was a breakdown of reality itself. What could push a ruler from loved to feared to hated in just 4 years? To understand why Caligula died the way he did, we have to go back to the childhood of a boy born into power, paranoia, and blood. Caligula was born on August 31st, 12 CE in Antium, Italy. His full name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but history would remember him by his childhood nickname, Caligula, meaning little boots. He was the third of 6 children born to Germanicus, a celebrated Roman general, and Agrippina the Elder, a direct descendant of Emperor Augustus. At first, his life seemed destined for greatness. His father, Germanicus, was beloved by both the army and the Roman people. His mother came from imperial blood. Together, they formed one of the most admired families in the empire. But admiration bred jealousy. When Caligula was just 7, Germanicus died suddenly in Syria. Many suspected poisoning, and all eyes turned to Tiberius, the reigning emperor, who had long seen Germanicus as a rival. After Germanicus's death, a series of tragedies followed. Caligula's mother and 2 older brothers were arrested and exiled. His mother was starved to death. His brothers died under suspicious circumstances. One by one, his family vanished. By age 12, Caligula had already lost nearly everyone close to him. In 27 CE, Tiberius summoned Caligula to the island of Capri, a luxurious estate infamous for its secrecy, cruelty, and rumor. There, Caligula spent 6 years under the watch of a ruler known for paranoia and sexual abuse. Historians have described Capri during this period as a place of moral decay and psychological torture. Caligula lived in silence, pretending loyalty to survive. In public, he smiled. In private, he watched. He learned that love could turn to betrayal overnight, and that power came from fear. But if Tiberius expected obedience, he miscalculated. Because the quiet boy on Capri wasn't broken. He was learning how the empire worked and what it took to control it. On the island of Capri, Caligula was cut off from the outside world, but he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by spies, informants, and exiles. People who had learned to survive in a world ruled by suspicion. Everyone smiled. Everyone lied. One mistake meant exile, torture, or execution. At age 16, Caligula watched Tiberius rule Rome from the shadows, not with laws, but with fear and humiliation. Tiberius had long abandoned the Senate. Instead, he relied on treason trials. He encouraged citizens to accuse each other. Executions were public. Confessions were extracted through torture, and paranoia became a tool of governance. Caligula was forced to live as a guest, but also a prisoner in this environment. He kept his head down. He memorized every lesson. He saw how flattery worked. He saw how cruelty was rewarded. He saw that emotions, love, loyalty, mercy were weaknesses in Rome's politics. He was taught rhetoric, Latin, Greek, and military discipline. But his real education came from watching Tiberius break powerful men without touching them. When Tiberius's only son died, Caligula's value rose. He became a candidate for succession, not because he was trusted, but because he had learned to play the role of the obedient heir. Behind closed doors, things were darker. Ancient accounts describe Caligula as already displaying signs of cruelty. He was fascinated by executions. He mocked the victims. He practiced smiling while imagining the deaths of senators. One Roman chronicler wrote that Caligula had never learned to hate cruelty, only to hide it. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had few real emotions left. He did not love. He did not mourn. He did not trust. He only observed, imitated, and waited. In 35 CE, Tiberius formally named Caligula a co-heir to the empire, alongside his grandson Gemellus. But the old emperor was sick. The question wasn't if Tiberius would die, it was when. And Caligula was no longer a boy. He was ready to step into power, not as a savior, but as the weapon Rome had created in its own image. In March of 37 CE, Emperor Tiberius lay on his deathbed. Caligula was 24 years old. When the old emperor finally stopped breathing, the transition wasn't peaceful. A rumor quickly spread. Caligula had smothered him with a pillow to speed things up. Whether or not it was true, the message was clear. Caligula would not wait. With the backing of the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite military unit, Caligula seized the title of emperor without resistance. The Senate confirmed him almost immediately. So did the people. Rome had grown tired of fear. The public remembered Germanicus, Caligula's father, as a hero. His son's rise felt like a return to better times. When Caligula arrived in Rome, the celebration was explosive. He freed political prisoners, abolished unpopular taxes, and honored his family's memory. Statues of Germanicus were restored. Exiles were recalled. Games were held for weeks. To many, Caligula appeared generous, kind, even just. He gave out large cash bonuses to soldiers. He promised to work with the Senate. He spoke of rebuilding Rome's moral core. Crowds cheered wherever he went. For the first few months, his rule looked like a golden age beginning. But that image didn't last long. Just 6 months into his reign, Caligula fell seriously ill. The cause was never confirmed. Some said poison. Others thought it was epilepsy or a brain infection. For weeks, he hovered near death. When he recovered, something had changed. The generous speeches stopped. The smiles faded. The executions began. He ordered the death of Gemellus, his co-heir. He accused senators of plotting against him. He reintroduced treason trials and made them more brutal. Whispers began to spread in the palace. The emperor was not sane. But the most terrifying part wasn't his illness. It was that he no longer cared what anyone thought. And now that he had absolute power, no one could stop what came next. After recovering from his illness, Caligula became unpredictable, not just politically, but personally. His first act was to remove anyone with a claim to the throne. He ordered the execution of Gemellus, his adoptive brother and co-heir. The reason? He coughed too much. He then forced Macro, the head of the Praetorian Guard who had helped him rise to power, to commit suicide. Macro's family was killed shortly after. From that moment forward, no one around Caligula was safe. Not advisors, not allies, not blood relatives. He declared himself a living god. Statues of himself as Jupiter, Apollo, and Mars were erected across Rome. He had temples dedicated to his worship and demanded that senators sacrifice to him, publicly or risk execution. He dressed in golden robes, wore women's jewelry, and appeared in public as a deity. He referred to himself as a god in all official documents, but his behavior wasn't just arrogant. It was cruel. He mocked senators by seating his horse in Citatus at banquets and allegedly promised to make the animal a consul. He wasn't confused. He was humiliating them, proving that their titles meant nothing to him. He revived the Maiestas trials, where any perceived insult to the emperor could be punished by death. No defense was possible. Accusers were rewarded with the property of the condemned. Public executions became entertainment. He ordered torture not in dungeons, but in theaters, in front of crowds. He bragged that he could kill anyone at any time, and no one would stop him. He created a law that no one was allowed to look at him from above, forcing people to demolish upper floors of buildings along the route of his parades. Wealthy citizens were accused of imaginary crimes, then executed, their estates seized by the emperor. Each purge filled his treasury. Each killing erased a threat. What had begun as a popular reign had become a reign of terror. But Caligula wasn't finished, because next he would turn the tools of the state, the military, the courts, the treasury, into weapons for personal vengeance. Once Caligula established dominance over the Senate, he moved to weaponize the empire's institutions. He transformed the Praetorian Guard, originally protectors of the emperor, into agents of terror. They carried out arrests, executions, and purges on Caligula's command, often without trial or warning. At any moment, they could drag a man from his home, confiscate his property, and kill his family, all under the guise of protecting the emperor. The Maesta's law, originally intended to protect the dignity of the state, was now used as a tool of control. Anyone could be accused of treason for a joke, a facial expression, or silence. Once accused, there was no defense. Confession was often extracted under torture. Caligula's cruelty became systematic. He installed secret agents in noble households and public gatherings. These informants reported casual conversations, offhand comments, even facial expressions. A single misstep could mean death. In public trials, Caligula would often attend in disguise. If he recognized someone who once spoke against him, even in private, he would reveal himself and order their immediate execution. He restructured the tax system to target the wealthy. Men were charged with made-up debts, then fined or imprisoned until they gave up land or businesses. He declared that anyone who inherited wealth owed a percentage to the emperor, even if unrelated. To fund his extravagant projects, he sold pardons, citizenships, and positions in government. Justice became a business. The empire became a marketplace of bribes. He ordered gladiator games where the combatants were not trained fighters, but prisoners and nobles. He enjoyed watching them die slowly. He would invite guests to dinner, then have one of them executed mid-meal, just to see how the others reacted. Fear wasn't a side effect of Caligula's rule. It was the mechanism. By making terror a routine part of life, Caligula kept Rome under control, not through loyalty or law, but through pure unpredictability. But while his enemies were quiet, his paranoia grew louder, and soon even his closest allies would become suspects. As Caligula's cruelty grew, his inner circle shrank. He began to see betrayal everywhere. In the Senate, among his guards, even within his own family. His 3 sisters, once beloved symbols of his rule, were not spared. He had Drusilla, his favorite sister, by his side constantly. Ancient accounts suggest an incestuous relationship, though the truth remains unclear. What is documented? When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 CE, Caligula was devastated. He declared her a goddess and demanded that the empire mourn her as they would a deity. But grief soon turned to suspicion. He exiled his other 2 sisters, Agrippina the younger and Julia Livilla, accusing them of plotting against him. They were publicly disgraced, stripped of titles, and forced into exile. Years later, Agrippina would return. But during Caligula's reign, no family bond was sacred. His wife, Caesonia, whom he married later in life, was paraded through Rome while pregnant, allegedly unclothed, to display her fertility. He later claimed their daughter would be raised as a goddess, but both mother and child were murdered with him during his assassination. Caligula's paranoia wasn't hidden. He refused to sleep in the same room twice. He surrounded himself with armed guards, even during private meetings. He had passageways and hiding spaces built throughout the palace. He once ordered his guards to execute a nobleman simply because the man looked at him with too much calm. Letters written during his reign describe Rome as silent, not peaceful, but quiet from fear. Conversations stopped. Invitations declined. People learned to speak in fragments and whispers. Trust vanished. He interrogated senators during meals. He watched their reactions. One twitch, one pause, and they could be gone the next day. He claimed to read faces, predict thoughts, and see guilt in the eyes of others. No evidence was needed, only a feeling. Even his Praetorian commanders, once his protectors, began to fear that loyalty was not enough. Power had isolated Caligula, but isolation only deepened his suspicion. And while he silenced others, his own thoughts began to spiral out of control, because what comes after paranoia is collapse. By the 3rd year of his reign, Caligula was no longer just feared. He was also visibly unstable. Contemporaries noted wild mood swings, sudden bursts of rage, and incoherent speeches. His physical appearance changed too. He grew gaunt, his skin turned pale, and he often appeared sleepless or trembling in public. Doctors were afraid to diagnose him. Any implication of weakness could be fatal. But some observers believed his mind had never fully recovered from his earlier illness, a severe fever that struck him just months after taking the throne. Others speculated about neurological damage, possibly from epilepsy, encephalitis, or even untreated trauma from his childhood. He began to speak to the moon. He would stare at it through his palace windows and whisper conversations. He claimed the moon spoke back. His guards were ordered not to interrupt. At night, he walked the palace corridors alone, muttering to himself, changing clothes, and pacing for hours. He once stood at the edge of a cliff in Gaul and ordered his troops to collect seashells, declaring them spoils of war from Neptune. He believed he was both human and God, a living embodiment of divine power. He addressed senators as his slaves, not subjects. He laughed during executions and applauded the deaths of former allies. But the most telling sign of decline was the isolation. He stopped trusting even his guards. He had new recruits trained personally, then executed them after their first week. He believed too much familiarity would breed betrayal. The Praetorian Guard, once his enforcers, became the next target of his suspicions. He insisted food tasters sample every dish. He tested wine on animals. He accused palace cooks of plotting to poison him and had several boiled alive. His world had become a prison of mirrors. Everyone watched him, and he trusted no one. What began as a show of divine power was now a descent into paranoia, hallucination, and physical exhaustion. But even in his weakest state, Caligula remained dangerous, and the people closest to him knew if he lived much longer, no one was safe. Caligula did not die in bed. There was no long illness, no quiet passing. His death came quickly, brutally, and without warning, at least to him. But for the men around him, it had been planned for months. By early 41 CE, the Praetorian Guard, once his loyal protectors, had turned against him. Caligula had humiliated them, replaced their leaders, and killed officers without cause. Even Cassius Chaerea, a seasoned officer known for his quiet discipline, had been mocked repeatedly by Caligula for his voice and appearance. One day, Caligula insulted Chaerea in public again. The next, Chaerea began organizing a conspiracy. The plan was simple: kill the emperor during the Palatine Games, when he would be most vulnerable. On January 24, 41 CE, as Caligula left a performance to walk through a palace tunnel, the assassins struck. First, Chaerea approached from behind and stabbed him in the neck. Then others followed, more than 30 stab wounds in total, delivered by men he had once trusted. Caligula collapsed in the hallway, bleeding onto the stone floor. His final words are not recorded. His guards fled. The scene was silent, except for the sound of sandals on marble. Within the hour, his wife Caesonia and infant daughter were also murdered. The conspirators left the bodies unburied for hours, a deliberate insult to the man who had demanded godlike treatment. The Roman Senate was informed, and many celebrated. But Rome didn't rejoice in the streets. The mood was cautious, tense. No one knew what would come next. There was no final decree from Caligula, no last letter, no spiritual reckoning. He died in the same way he ruled, suddenly, violently, without mercy. For those who killed him, it was justice. For the empire, it was uncertainty. Because removing a tyrant doesn't restore order. It opens a vacuum, and the question of who would take his place would be answered by chance. Caligula was dead. The conspirators believed the Senate would immediately restore the Republic, a return to Rome's earlier, more democratic system of governance. But that didn't happen. The Senate convened and debated, but they hesitated. Many had survived Caligula by pretending loyalty. Few had real power. And outside the Senate chamber, the Praetorian Guard was already moving. In the chaos after the assassination, soldiers found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. He was 50 years old, seen by many as weak, stuttering, and politically irrelevant. But the Guard saw opportunity. They declared Claudius emperor, bypassing the Senate entirely. It was a military decision, not a political one. Within hours, Claudius was escorted to the Praetorian camp, surrounded by armed men, and presented as Rome's new ruler. The Senate was stunned. They had killed a tyrant, but failed to seize power. The Republic would not return. Instead, one autocrat was replaced by another. Claudius quickly ordered the execution of the main conspirators, including Chaerea. Though he may have despised Caligula, Claudius understood stability required punishment. Rome could not allow emperors to be overthrown without consequence. Caligula's decrees were erased. His statues were destroyed. His name was banned from official records. But the fear he created didn't vanish. Many senators who had served him remained in office. Survivors of his purges stayed silent. The same systems of power, the guard, the courts, the treasury, remained in place. Caligula's death didn't end the imperial machine. It simply redirected it. And in that moment, Rome learned a brutal truth. A tyrant could fall, but the empire would continue. For centuries, Caligula has been remembered as one of the most deranged rulers in Roman history. Ancient writers like Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus portrayed him as violent, delusional, and sexually perverse. Their accounts are full of shocking details: incest, random killings, and religious blasphemy. But modern historians have raised questions. Were all these stories true, or were they political weapons, exaggerated or invented to justify his assassination and discredit his dynasty? Caligula left behind no personal writings, no speeches, no memoirs. Everything we know about him comes from sources written after his death, often by people loyal to his enemies. Some scholars argue that many stories, like making his horse a consul, may have been satire, misunderstood as fact. Others believe they were real but symbolic, meant to humiliate the Senate, not elevate the animal. His claim of being a god may have been part of a political strategy, not a sign of madness. Several Roman emperors, including Augustus and later emperors, were deified. Caligula may have simply taken the idea further. Still, the pattern of violence and instability is hard to dismiss. Even modern defenders admit he was ruthless, erratic, and dangerously impulsive. The psychological trauma of his childhood, the brutal loss of his family, and the 6 years on Capri under Tiberius likely shaped a damaged man with access to absolute power. Medical theories have also emerged. Some believe he suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, which could explain hallucinations, mood swings, and sudden aggression. Others suspect encephalitis or lead poisoning, both common in ancient Rome due to poor sanitation and food storage. In the end, Historians agree on one point: whether madman, manipulator, or myth, Caligula's reign exposed how fragile Rome's imperial system really was. A single man, unrestrained, could bring a superpower to the brink of collapse. And even 2,000 years later, his name remains a warning. Caligula ruled for just 4 years. He passed no lasting reforms, won no major wars, and built nothing that endured. But his reign left behind something else. A blueprint of how absolute power can unravel the mind, the state, and the people it rules. He showed Rome that fear could be faster than law, that loyalty meant nothing without structure, that the wrong person in the right position could turn an empire into a personal stage for cruelty. His rule forced changes behind the scenes. Later emperors, including Claudius and Nero, created more defined systems of surveillance, succession, and ceremonial control to prevent another Caligula. But none of those systems erased the memory. In Roman culture, Caligula became a symbol, not of madness, but of unchecked rule. His name became shorthand for tyranny. In modern times, he's referenced in studies of dictatorship, mental illness, and state violence. He is taught not as a leader, but as a lesson, that charisma, heritage, and early hope can be undone by a single weakness: lack of limits. And yet, despite the horror, his story still fascinates, not because of what he built, but because of how fast it fell apart. He was the emperor who believed he was a god, and he died alone, in a hallway, stabbed by his own guards. He thought he was untouchable, a god in human form. But in the end, Caligula died like any man, afraid, betrayed, and forgotten in a ditch. But what happens when the cruelty doesn't end with death? What if it continues, night after night, hidden behind castle walls, with victims drained of blood by a noblewoman who believed youth could be stolen from the bodies of the dead? Next, the queen who bathed in blood, the true horror story of Elizabeth Bathory, one of history's most prolific killers. Tap here to watch it now.